There's one chapter of human history most people would rather skip. It's uncomfortable, it's dark, and it happened far more often and far more recently than most of us assume. We're talking about cannibalism, not as some ancient myth or horror movie plot, but as a documented, repeated survival strategy that shows up again and again across human history, whenever things got desperate enough. It's about ordinary people pushed to the absolute edge of survival, and the uncomfortable choices some of them made when there was nothing left to eat. Before we go further, it's worth separating two very different things that both fall under the same uncomfortable word. There's survival cannibalism, a last resort act driven by starvation, when a group has genuinely run out of any other option. And there's funerary or ritual cannibalism, a deliberate cultural practice tied to grief, respect, or spiritual belief, often involving consuming a small part of someone who has already died naturally. These aren't the same story. They don't come from the same motivations, and mixing them up is where most of the myths and misunderstandings about this topic actually begin. The oldest solid evidence for this behavior comes from a cave called Grandalina in northern Spain. Bones belonging to Homo antecessor, an ancestor species roughly 800,000 years old, were found with cut marks strikingly similar to the marks left on animal bones that had clearly been butchered for food. The pattern wasn't accidental damage. It matched deliberate processing, the same techniques used on deer or other prey. This wasn't some isolated modern horror. It's evidence that this behavior may have existed almost as long as our genus has existed at all. It wasn't just our distant ancestors either. At sites like Moula Gersi in France and El Cedrón in Spain, researchers have found Neanderthal bones bearing the same telltale cut marks, deliberate fractures for extracting bone marrow, and butchering patterns identical to how Neanderthals processed deer and other game. Whether this came from starvation, ritual, or conflict between rival groups is still debated. But what's clear is this: multiple different human species, separated by hundreds of thousands of years, independently ended up in situations where this became part of the story.
To understand why, you have to understand just how thin the margin for survival really was. During Ice Age winters, food could disappear for weeks at a time. A failed hunt wasn't a minor setback. It could mean actual starvation within days. When a group has already eaten everything available, when the last stored meat is gone and the next herd is nowhere in sight, the human body starts making decisions the mind never would in normal circumstances. Extreme starvation doesn't just weaken you physically. It fundamentally reshapes what a person is capable of choosing. Not every documented case involves starvation, though. The Fore people of Papua New Guinea historically practiced a funerary custom where, out of grief and respect, family members would consume small amounts of tissue from relatives who had already died of natural causes. To them, this wasn't horrifying. It was an act of love, a way of keeping a loved one close rather than leaving them behind. Anthropologists studying this culture found something else too, something that would turn this practice into one of the strangest medical mysteries of the 20th century.
In the 1950s, researchers noticed something disturbing happening within the Fore community, a mysterious illness called kuru, which caused people to lose coordination, tremble uncontrollably, and eventually die. It took years to trace the cause. A misfolded protein called a prion passed directly through consuming infected brain tissue during funerary rituals. Once the practice stopped, kuru cases eventually disappeared. It remains one of the clearest real-world examples of why deep cultural taboos around this behavior may have evolved in the first place. Not superstition, but a hidden layer of biological self-protection. This same desperate pattern has repeated itself throughout recorded history, whenever entire populations were trapped without food for extended periods. Historical accounts from prolonged sieges across Europe and Asia describe communities reduced to unimaginable choices after months of starvation cut off every normal source of food. These weren't isolated criminals or outliers. They were doctors, parents, and neighbors, making decisions under a level of prolonged starvation that most of us, thankfully, will never have to comprehend. One of the most well-documented modern cases is the Donner Party, a group of American pioneers who, in the winter of 1846, became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains after a series of disastrous delays. Snowed in, with no way out, and supplies running dangerously low, roughly half the group didn't survive the winter. Some of those who did survive later admitted that, after every other option had been exhausted, they resorted to eating those who had already died. It remains one of the most studied survival cannibalism cases in American history, precisely because it was so thoroughly documented by the survivors themselves. This isn't only ancient or 19th century history either. In 1972, a plane carrying a rugby team crashed high in the Andes Mountains. Survivors were stranded for over 2 months in freezing, oxygen-thin conditions with no food and no rescue in sight. After exhausting every possible alternative, the survivors made the agonizing decision to consume the bodies of those who had already died in order to stay alive long enough to be found. When the story became public, many of the survivors spoke openly about it, not out of shame, but because they believed the truth mattered more than the discomfort of the topic. What's striking across nearly every documented case is how consistently survivors describe the same internal process, not a casual decision, but an agonizing last resort, made only after every other option had genuinely run out. Psychologists who've studied extreme survival situations note that prolonged starvation doesn't just affect the body. It affects judgment, morality, and the basic sense of what's acceptable, as the brain increasingly prioritizes sheer survival over everything else. It's not that these people stopped being human. It's that survival at its most extreme can override almost everything we normally consider unthinkable. Almost every human culture on record, independent of location or era, treats this behavior as one of the strongest taboos that exists. That kind of near-universal reaction is rarely accidental. Researchers believe part of it may be rooted in genuine biological risk. Consuming human tissue carries a higher chance of transmitting disease, since pathogens adapted to a human host spread most efficiently between humans. In other words, disgust may not just be a cultural rule. It may be an ancient survival mechanism in its own right, protecting groups from a very real and very biological danger.
So how do researchers actually confirm this happened thousands of years after the fact, with no witnesses left to ask? It comes down to careful forensic comparison. Scientists examine cut marks, deliberate bone fractures used to access marrow, and cooking damage, then compare those exact patterns to known animal butchering techniques from the same time and place. When human bones show the identical signature, mixed in among ordinary food waste rather than buried respectfully, it builds a strong case that this wasn't ritual. It was, quite simply, food processing. When you actually line up the documented cases, ancient hominids, Neanderthals, sieges, pioneer expeditions, plane crash survivors, a clear pattern emerges. This behavior doesn't show up because a specific group of people were somehow broken or different. It shows up wherever the exact same conditions repeat: total isolation, complete food scarcity, and no realistic hope of outside help arriving in time. It's less a story about who these people were, and much more a story about what those specific, brutal circumstances can do to absolutely anyone.
At the end of it all, this isn't really a story about horror. It's a story about how far the human will to survive is willing to go, and how our deepest taboos exist for very real reasons, even when circumstances occasionally push people past them entirely. Every documented case ends the same way, not with judgment from those who lived through it, but with a quiet, heavy understanding of just how thin the line can be between an ordinary life and an impossible choice. If stories like this, the uncomfortable, honest parts of human history, are what you're here for, subscribe. There's a lot more of this hidden history still to uncover.